大家好，欢迎来到我们的华尔街争议节目。今天我们要讨论的是一起关于中国大陆 YouTuber 在台北市政府用餐的事件，这个事件引发了不少的关注和讨论。这位 YouTuber 在台北市政府的员工餐厅用餐时，感受到的自由和民主令他惊讶，因为在中国大陆，进入政府机关和食堂是极其困难的。他直言这种开放的态度让他感受到真正的为人民服务。相较之下，中国的政府机关却往往将人民拒之门外，这样的对比让他对台北的印象大为改观。然而，在台北市政府工作的员工和附近的居民对这种开放的做法早已习以为常，并未感受到特别之处。值得注意的是，台北市政府的员工餐厅因为经营问题已经暂停营业，这背后又是怎样的经济和社会现实呢？学者们指出，没有民主制度的为人民服务只是空话。30年前台湾的官僚作风与中国大陆其实并无二致。这一事件也引来了网民的热烈讨论，许多人表达了对中国政府的批评和对民主体制的向往。这不仅仅是一次用餐的经历，更是一场有关自由、民主和政府责任的深刻思考。请大家继续收看详细内容。在一个阳光明媚的早晨，中国大陆的 YouTuber 严大陆步入了台北市政府。这个在台湾旅行的年轻人，此刻正如一个充满好奇心的探险者，走向了一次令人意想不到的旅行体验。对他来说，这不仅仅是一栋建筑，更是一个对比鲜明的场所，与他熟悉的中国政府机关截然不同。严大陆先是看到台北市政府入口处站着的保安，不禁感到一丝紧张，心中自嘲道：不知道会不会待会儿被当成匪谍抓起来。然而，出乎他的意料，他无需经过任何安检，便顺利进入了市府大楼，踏入了地下1楼的员工餐厅。这一幕对他来说无异于一次文化震撼，宛如打开了一扇通向陌生世界的大门。这位曾经在央视工作了3年的 YouTuber， 对于政府机关的神秘与威严并不陌生。在北京，即便是他这样曾在央视任职过的人，进入政府大楼都需要严格的身份审查，更别提在政府食堂用餐。然而，这次在台北市政府的餐厅，他仅仅花了90新台币，便品尝到了一顿正常水平的午餐，价钱公道，味道不俗，这对于习惯了大陆高物价的游客来说，实在是物超所值。这次经历在严大陆心中激起了深刻的反思。他感慨地表示，在中国，政府大楼通常是拒人于千里之外的，而在这里，是政府竟对普通民众敞开大门，这种差距带给他的冲击无疑是巨大的。他体会到的不仅是餐厅美食的价廉物美，更是民主社会的开放与包容。在严大陆的影片发布后，许多中国大陆的观众纷纷在社交媒体上发表评论，表达了他们的惊讶与羡慕。有些人指出，这种对比体现的是两种治理体系的根本差异。在民主社会中，政府是真正为民众服务的机构，而在专制体制下，政府则更像是一座难以接近的衙门。这段关于台湾政府机关亲民的影像，在中国大陆引发了不小的轰动。微博上一名知名用户转发了该视频，不久后却被平台禁言15天，理由是涉嫌违反国家相关法律法规。这种对比之下，网友们感叹，专制集权最怕的就是真相的揭示。他们在评论中讽刺说，只有在井里才能歌颂井里的美好，井外的世界则被静音。而在台湾，市政府的员工和附近居民对于这种开放的政策早已习以为常。市政府餐厅自3月以来因无承包商投标而暂停营业，而选择在餐厅内由摊商贩售便当。市府员工陈先生表示，附近商场和食店众多，午餐选择丰富可能也是餐厅停业的原因之一。这次跨越海峡的体验不仅让严大陆个人感慨万千，也引发了不同社会制度下人们的反思和讨论。台湾的开放与包容，在一次简单的午餐中给予了这位大陆游客深刻的印象和思考，而这一切仅仅是在台北市政府的大门之后展开的。欢迎大家进入6度探索的辩论环节。我们从正反两个角度对本节目进行辩论，请出我们的辩论高手楚天舒、谢琪琪。
我是楚天舒。
我是谢琪琪。
首先，我们要谈到民主与政府开放之间的关系。台北市政府的开放性实际上是台湾民主制度的一种体现。 民主制度的根本特点就是政府为人民服务，而非高居上位的权力机器。回顾历史，美国的独立战争和法国大革命都是追求民众对政府的监督权和开放性。开放的政府设施不仅能提高政府透明度，也能增进民众对政府的信任。根据2019年的国际透明度组织报告，民主国家的腐败指数往往较低，开放的政府设施无疑有助于减少政府腐败，增加民众参与。这种开放政策不是为了开放而开放，而是一种让民众感受到政府随时在侧的良好体验，拉近了政府与人民之间的距离。
楚天舒，你说的好像政府开放就能解决所有问题似的。别忘了，民主制度也不是一劳永逸的。在美国，不是一样有水门事件和监听丑闻吗？开放的政府设施只是表面功夫，真正的民主在于制度与执行。你说开放能降低腐败指数，那为什么一些开放国家的腐败问题依旧存在呢？比如印度，政府极其开放，但是腐败问题依然严重。再说了，台北市政府开放就等于台湾民主好吗？要我说，市政府开放也可能是因为台湾人不太关心地方政治，去市政府吃个饭就算民主了，这么简单。中国的政府设施更重视安全和效率，这在一个拥有14亿人口的国家是很重要的。开放的门未必能带来真诚的交流，相反，可能只是一次旅游打卡的表演罢了。
谢琪琪，你提到的美国水门事件和印度的腐败问题，正好说明了民主国家至少是有机制去揭露和纠正错误的。水门事件之后，美国就加强了对政府行为的监督，提出了更多关于信息公开的法律。印度的问题在于制度落实，而不是制度设计。民主制度不完美，但它提供了一个不断改进的框架。反观中国，很多时候连问题本身都很难被公开讨论。并不是说中国没有进步，而是其封闭性的体制导致了民众对政府的不信任和误解。台湾市政府的开放在某种程度上也说明了他们不怕被质疑，因为他们有信心能接受公众的审视。这种透明的氛围对中国游客来说或许是一种新鲜体验，但也正好是他们所缺失的。90台币的午餐并不是重点，重点是它代表了一种对待民众的态度。
哎呦，听起来台湾民主好像很完美哦，但别忘了，台湾的政治斗争也很激烈，立法院的全武行可是全球闻名的。台湾的民主也有其弊端，比如政策难以通过，政府效率低下等等。你说中国游客感动于台北市政府的开放，但这更像是因为他们在一个陌生的文化环境中产生的错觉。中国的封闭政策是基于社会稳定和安全的考虑，想想看，14亿人民的国家，任何政策的变动都可能引发大规模的社会波动，取得这样的平衡是非常困难的。在某些方面，中国确实需要更多透明度和开放性，但每个国家都有其国情，不能一概而论。还有，那些中国游客可能更关注的是台湾的风景和美食，而非政治制度。市政府开放对他们来说，可能只是一个旅程中的小插曲，而不是对两岸制度的深刻反思。
的确，制度没有完美的，但这不代表我们不追求改进。台湾立法院的全武行可以说是民主的一部分，尽管激烈，却反映了各种声音的存在。在一个多元化的社会中，纷争不可避免，但这恰恰是民主制度的活力所在。相比之下，中国的所谓稳定，有时更多是一种压制，许多声音被淹没在和谐的表象之下。你提到中国的安全考虑，但安全不该成为不开放的借口。看看日本，人口老龄化和经济压力同样巨大，却依然保持了开放的政府设施和制度。中国有其国情，但这并不意味着不需要反思和改进。台湾市政府的开放或许只是小小一步，但它象征的却是对政府角色和公民权利的理解。对于那些在中国无法体验到这些的游客而言，这不仅是异国的风景，也是制度差异的活生生的对比。
哈，楚天舒，你的理想主义真是让人忍俊不禁。台湾的民主是生动的，没错，但它有时候更像是一场政治秀。看看那些政治人物为了选票无所不用其极，这样的民主真的就比稳定的治理好吗？ 日本确实开放，但他们也面临着很多挑战，特别是经济增长放缓和少子化的问题。而中国在近几十年间取得的经济成就可是有目共睹的。虽然有不够开放的地方，但中国政府的效率和执行力在很多方面是无可比拟的。再说了，那些中国游客在台北市政府的经历，更多是文化冲击，而非政治觉醒。他们可能只是因为能在政府食堂吃一顿饭觉得新鲜，而不是因为台湾的民主制度。最后，这种浅层次的体验并不足以真正引发关于民主的深刻思考。更何况，在微博上评论这些还可能被禁言，说明这类讨论还是敏感而复杂的。
我是评委合理，我想对两位精彩的辩论做出评论。楚天舒和谢琪琪的辩论展现了对于民主与政府开放之间复杂关系的深入思考。两位辩手各自代表了不同的观点。楚天舒主张政府的开放性是民主制度的重要体现，而谢琪琪则质疑这重开放是否实际上能解决问题。楚天舒的论点集中在政府透明度与民众信任之间的正相关上。他提到民主制度能够为民众提供监督政府的机制，并引述国际透明度报告以支持其观点。然而，这种理想主义却未能考虑到，正如谢琪琪所提到的，开放并不总能带来真正的透明和责任。以水门事件为例，即使在民主国家，仍然会出现深层次的腐败和滥权现象。谢琪琪的观点则提出了对民主制度的批判，认为其弊端如政策效率低下和激烈的政治斗争，可能让民众对治理感到失望。他提到中国的安全考量，认为在大国治理下，稳定是一种必须，而过度开放则可能引发社会动荡。这样的论述令人警醒，即使民主制度看似理想，但在实际运行中却充满挑战。楚天舒以台北市政府的开放作为例子，试图表明这是一种政府对民众权益的重视和负责态度，而谢琪琪则指出，这样的开放可能仅仅是文化观光的表面现象，并非真正的民主实践。他的反驳有助于提醒我们，政府开放的形式不应该与实质相混淆，并且民主的实践需具体而深入。总体来看，两位辩手的讨论揭示了民主制度及政府开放的复杂性。楚天舒的理想主义与谢琪琪的现实主义形成鲜明对比，尤其是在面对不同国情和文化的情境下，不同的观点也为我们的思考提供了多元的视角。最终，这场辩论引发了对政府透明度、民众参与以及治理效率的深刻反思，值得我们在日常生活中继续探讨。
大家好，欢迎来到我们的亚洲大眼睛节目。今天我们要聚焦于印尼经济的最新动态。这个刚刚上任的普拉博沃总统正面临住前所未有的挑战。根据彭博社的报道，印尼第三季度的 GDP 增长仅为 4.95%， 这不仅低于预期，也创下了自去年以来最慢的增长速度。这对于普拉博沃而言无疑是记重击，因为他曾雄心勃勃的承诺将经济增长提升至 8%。如今，印尼的制造业出现了裂痕，尤其是面对海外需求减少和廉价进口的双重压力，许多工厂正陷入倒闭的困境，裁员人数也在不断增加。根据最新数据，裁员人数比去年增长 31%， 接近6万人。这一切都让中产阶级的消费能力受到重创，影响了整体经济形势。尽管如此，印尼政府已经开始采取措施，例如针对购房的税收优惠和进口关税的调整，希望能够保护本地市场。可是这些政策能否有效扭转经济下滑的趋势，还需时间来验证。而花旗集团的经济学家们则指出，印尼需要向出口导向型的服务业转型，以创造更多的就业机会。总之，普拉博沃的每一步决策都将受到密切关注，这不仅是对他施政能力的考验，也是印尼未来发展的风向标。在这场经济的持久战中， 印尼能否找到新的增长动力，值得我们期待。请大家继续收看详细内容，让我们深入剖析这场经济挑战。但印尼新任总统普拉博沃必要面临一个严峻的经济挑战。第三季度的经济增长数据显得尤为刺眼。根据彭博社的报告，印尼今年第三季度的国内生产总值 GDP 同比增长仅为是 95%， 这低于此前经济学家们普遍预期的 5%。这一增速是自去年同期增长是 94% 以来最缓慢的季度增长表现。这一数字不仅像警钟般提醒着普拉博沃，也清晰地揭示出印尼经济增长所面临的瓶颈。总统在就职典礼上曾信誓旦旦地承诺要把印尼的经济增长率提高到 8%， 但显然现实中的挑战远比想象要大得多。尽管印尼的经济增长速度在东南亚地区依然名列前茅，但该国的制造业却显现出裂痕。制造业的疲软可能会对就业和消费支出造成威胁，而这对于拥有1兆美元经济体量的印尼至关重要。特别是服装和制鞋业这些劳动密集型产业，正遭遇海外需求锐减和廉价进口产品涌入国内市场的双重打击。像纺织巨头甩彩车和潘氏兄弟纺织集团这样的企业，正面临着工厂倒闭和日益增加的债务困境。这些困境无疑加剧了整个行业的萎缩，急需政策的扶持和创新的解决方案。与此同时，印尼劳动市场的失衡也愈加明显。根据印尼劳工部的数据，截至10月份，裁员人数比去年同期增加了 31%， 达到近6万人。这一趋势成为印尼经济复苏道路上的沉重负担。标准普尔全球采购经理人指数显示，印尼的制造业活动已经连续4个月萎缩，这是自2021年以来最长的一次下滑。显然，新冠疫情的阴影依然笼罩着这个国家，许多人尚未恢复到正式就业的状态。950万人从中产阶级的行列中跌落。而这个群体曾是推动国内消费的主力军，其消费额占到国内生产总值的1半以上。印尼政府并非对此视而不见，他们推出了一系列的应对措施，试图扭转经济的颓势，例如通过扩大购房税收优惠以及征收进口关税来保护本地市场。与此同时，印尼央行也已经开始下调基准利率，以刺激消费和投资。然我币市场的波动迫使这些宽松政策不得不暂时搁置。面对经济增长的放缓，花旗集团的经济学家赫米 Helman 在一份报告中强调，印尼需要重新调整产业政策，特别是发展出口导向型服务业，以便使经济增长超过 5%。他指出，虽然矿物园产业在普拉博沃及其前任佐科威的人导下有所发展，然而他并未创造出足够的就业机会。赫尔米进一步指出，旅游业等服务出口产品的劳动密集程度较高，可能会带来更多的外汇收入和就业岗位。虽然这一点在政府的计划中尚未被突出强调，但他认为这应成为印尼经济策略的新方向。在普拉博沃的领导下，印尼能否化解当前的经济挑战，找到新的增长动力，仍需时间的验证。但无论如何，这位新总统的每一步决策都将受到密切关注，既是对其执政能力的考验，也是印尼未来发展方向的风向标。随着时间的推移，印尼的经济复苏之路将如何展开，全球都在侧耳倾听。
请大家继续收看节目的六博士的分析评论。印尼的经济增长在第三季度有些不如意，工厂倒闭和裁员潮让经济显得有些疲软。这对刚上任的总统普拉博沃来说，简直就是迎头一击。他当初在就职典礼中可是信誓旦旦要把印尼的经济增长拉到 8% 呢。然而，最新数据却显示，印尼 GDP 只增长了 4.95%， 离前总统佐科威追求的增长目标还有一段不小的距离。这就好比普拉博沃踌躇满志的准备冲向终点，却被路上的坑坑洼洼给绊了个踉跄。看来，普拉博沃得在经济政策上多动动脑筋了。印尼的制造业一向是经济的主力军，但最近的情况却不太妙。劳动密集型产业如服装和制鞋业正受到海外需求减弱和廉价进口品冲击的双重夹击，就像是一个舞台上本应光芒四射的主角，结果被其他演员抢了风头。倒闭的工厂越来越多，裁员的消息此起彼伏，裁员人数较去年增加了 31%， 达到近6万人。
看着如此迅猛的削减潮，不少人恐怕都要割下筷子，心里默默盘算起未来的日子怎么熬。数据显示，印尼制造业活动已经连续4个月萎缩，这可是自2021年以来最长的下滑期。对于那些还没从疫情中完全复原过来的人来说，无疑是雪上加霜。中产阶级的大幅缩水，也给经济带来了不小的压力。印尼政府正积极推出措施，例如扩大购房税收优惠和征收进口关税，希望能护住本地市场这棵摇钱树。印尼央行甚至动用了降息神器，希望能刺激消费和投资。然而，货币波动让这一招变得有点捉襟见肘了。花旗集团的经济学家赫尔米指出，印尼必要调整产业政策，向出口导向型服务业转型，这才是经济增长的可行之道。他暗示，普拉博沃专注的矿物原产业虽然可以帮助经济增长，但就业机会创造的不够多。而旅游业这样的服务出口产业却拥有更高的劳动密集度，能够创造更多的就业机会和外汇收入。赫尔米的话就像是给普拉博沃的一个提醒，想要经济腾飞，不能只盯着地下的矿石，也要抬头看看那些飞往世界各地的飞机。总的来说，印尼当前的经济形势对普拉博沃提出了不小的挑战。尽管 GDP 增速在东南亚国家中保持领先，但挑战仍然不小。普拉博沃要想实现他所设想的宏伟经济目标，还需要在产业政策和经济结构上进行更多调整。希望他能在解决制造业困境的同时，抓住服务业的机会，将印尼经济推向新的高度。经济是一场持久战，普拉博沃现在需要的是稳住当前，着眼未来。印尼人民期待着他的施政能带来更多的就业机会和繁荣的生活。
欢迎大家进入6度探索的辩论环节，我们从正反两个角度对本节目进行辩论，请出我们的辩论高手楚天舒、谢琪琪。
普拉博沃总统上任后，经济增速虽然暂时放缓，但他有明确的目标和计划来扭转局势。他的计划包括发展出口导向型服务业，这不仅能刺激经济增长，还能创造更多就业机会。正如历史上我们看到的，许多国家在经济转型时期都会经历短暂的增长放缓，但最终通过结构调整实现了更高的增长率。例如，中国在改革开放初期也经历了相似的挑战，却最终成为全球第2大经济体。普拉博沃的计划有望带领印尼走向更高的经济水平。
楚天舒，你说的那么乐观，但实际上，印尼面临的是巨大的结构性问题。工厂倒闭，制造业萎缩，可不是短期能解决的，通过服务业转型更是需要时间。别忘了，普拉博沃就职时豪言壮志要把经济增长提高到 8%， 目前连 5% 都成问题。当年苏哈托政权时期，印尼也尝试过经济改革，但因为内部腐败和政策失误，很多计划都没有实现。普拉博沃需要的不仅是计划，更是执行力和透明的治理结构。
谢琪琪，你说的固然有一定道理，但普拉博沃总统并不是在盲目乐观。他已经开始采取措施，比如扩大购房税收优惠和征收进口关税，这些政策正在保护本地市场。印尼央行也在下调基准利率，以刺激消费和投资。这种多管齐下的办法在其他国家是有先例的，比如在欧洲，量化宽松政策曾有效缓解经济危机。印尼的中产阶级虽然受到打击，但这也正是政府政策的发力点。通过提升居民消费能力，印尼经济有机会恢复活力。
楚天舒，你说的措施像是给病人开了止痛药，而不是治本。扩大购房税收优惠对于那些失去工作的劳工有多大用处呢？征收进口关税可能短期内保护了本地市场，但从长远看可能导致市场封闭和效率低下。印尼面临的问题不仅是经济增速，还包括社会矛盾和发展不平衡。我们不能忽视印尼在政治腐败、基础设施落后等方面的挑战，正如20世纪70年代拉美国家的进口替代战略，最终导致经济停滞和大量的债务危机，所以普拉博沃需要更全面的改革思路。
谢奇奇，任何经济改革都会有阵痛，但关键在于坚持正确的方向。印尼政府已经意识到过度依赖矿业的弊端，正在积极转向服务业和更多元化的经济模式。虽然短期内可能面临困难，但这些调整将为印尼带来长远的收益。正如韩国在上世纪90年代的金融危机后，通过改革和创新，成功转型为高科技和服务业驱动的经济体。印尼有相同的潜力，只要政府能够维持政策连贯性和透明度，就有可能实现转型成功。
楚天舒，你的信心比印尼的经济增长还高。不过，韩国的成功有赖于其高水平的教育和强大的研发能力，印尼的人力资本现状远不及此。普拉博沃的改革计划需要面对的是一个既缺乏高效政府管理，又没有足够创新能力的经济体。我们不能只谈可能性，而忽视现实的限制。普拉博沃需要从基础教育、社会福利到反腐败等多方面下手，打造一个更稳固的经济基础，否则一切努力都可能竹篮打水一场空。
我是评委合理，我想对两位精彩的辩论做出评论。楚天舒和谢奇奇在辩论中展现了各自对印尼经济现状及未来发展的观点，两者都提供了有力的论据和例子，令人深思。首先，楚天舒的观点体现了一种乐观的态度，认为普拉博沃政府的改革计划有潜力推动印尼经济向前发展。他提到的出口导向型服务业的发展，以及其他如购房税收优惠和基准利率下调的措施，显示出他对政府政策的支持。无疑，这些计划若能有效执行，将对印尼的长期经济增长提供助力。然而，楚天舒对于短期困难的忽视以及过于乐观的预期，让其论点略显薄弱。反观谢奇奇则更具现实感，他指出印尼面临的结构性问题，并强调普拉博沃所需的不仅仅是政策，更是能够有效执行这些政策的治理能力。他提到的历史教训，如苏哈托政权时期的失败，对于强调改革的必要性以及面对腐败、基础设施落后等问题的挑战，无疑提供了深刻的警示。谢奇奇的观点更加现实，清楚地指出了印尼在改革过程中可能遇到的阻碍。在辩论中，两位辩手的立场鲜明且有力，但也存在着明显的分歧。楚天舒对未来的信心与谢奇奇对现实挑战的关注形成了鲜明对比。这种辩论的价值在于，它不仅反映了不同的经济观点，也揭示了当前印尼所面临的复杂性。总结来说，楚天舒的乐观主义和谢奇奇的现实主义为我们提供了关于印尼经济改革的重要视角。虽然楚天舒强调的长远利益和潜力值得肯定，但谢奇奇所提到的结构性困境和治理挑战同样不容忽视。未来印尼的经济发展需要在乐观的政策实施与现实的挑战之间找到一个平衡点。两位辩手的表现都非常出色，为我们深入理解印尼的经济状况提供了宝贵的参考。
In many ways, if you set aside the unpredictable wars in the Middle East and Europe, the primary driver of recent US foreign policy has been competition with China. If you want to pass a climate change bill, make it about China. If you have a big industrial policy plan, make it about China. If you want to get the G7 to align on something, make it about China. And just as there's agreement on being tough on China, there's also a fair bit of agreement on partnering more closely with countries like Japan, South Korea, and India. Now, whether that's right or wrong, it has become an animating principle in Washington, with both parties largely, but not entirely, in the same camp. So the question is, where do Trump and Harris actually disagree? I have two excellent guests with me today. Ryan Haas served as the director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the NSC between 2013 and 2017. He is now director of the John L. Thornton China Center at Brookings. And Lynn Kwok is also at Brookings now. She's the Lee Kuan Yew Chair in Southeast Asia Studies there. Ryan, Lynn, welcome back to FP Live.
Thank you, Ravi. It's great to be with you.
Thank you so much, Ravi, for having us.
So, Ryan, I'm going to start with you first, and we have to begin with China. What do we know about how Trump and Harris differ on managing Washington's relationship with Beijing?
Well, I actually think that there is a fairly wide divergence between how a Trump administration or a Harris administration would approach China. This cuts a little bit against the grain because the commonly held view in Washington is that there's a consensus on dealing with China. But if you really look at the potential leaders, President Trump is focused on trying to find leverage to secure concrete objectives, concrete measurable goals. And in the first term, he was fixated on the trade deficit as a proxy of fairness in the U.S.-China relationship. Fast forward to 2024, 2025, the trade deficit is still with us. And I expect that if he is reelected, that this will be an issue that he will focus intently on as well. And to get at the trade deficit, he needs to find sources of leverage. The source of leverage that he prefers most is tariffs and his unpredictability. This irascible, unanticipable nature of the way that he approaches China. The other feature that makes President Trump unique is his commitment to personal chemistry. This innate belief that he has that through charm and charisma and personal rapport, he can bend other leaders to his will, including Xi Jinping. And that is part of why Donald Trump goes out of his way during campaign events to praise President Xi, even though the overall mood in the United States towards China is pretty dark and negative. He's trying to put in this bank of goodwill for future use with President Xi, the ability to try to move him on issues that are a priority to him. Now, looking at the other side of the ledger, I don't think that Vice President Harris as president would adopt any of those approaches necessarily. She's much more focused on taking a conceptual view of strengthening America's long-term competitiveness for dealing with a ascendant China. And in her articulation, the most important elements of that are investing at home in America's sources of domestic strength and aligning with allies, cohering with them to present more of a united front for pushing back against Chinese transgressions. Those are not high priorities for President Trump, and that's where the split sort of emerges.
Ryan, just one thing there I have to point out, and this has come up in the debates as well. You mentioned the importance of tariffs for Trump, but the Biden administration continued many of the Trump tariffs on China. Doesn't that mean then that there is a fair bit of consistency over the last 7 or 8 years on China policy?
I think that philosophically, Harris and Trump have different views of what tariffs are capable of doing. I think that President Trump views tariffs as this magic weapon that can be deployed at will to make the world more in his likeness and preference. He has talked about tariffs as being able to solve America's childcare problems, its healthcare problems, its infrastructure problems. Vice President Harris doesn't talk of tariffs in these ways. She views them much more as a narrow targeted tool to protect specific industries that are running up against state-backed competition from China. So I actually think that the analogy breaks down when you start to look at it a little bit more closely.
Lynn, let me bring you in here, just flipping this a little bit. Do you know or have any sense of whether Xi Jinping would rather a Trump or a Harris presidency?
There's a saying that the devil alone knows the mind of man, and I think that's particularly true in the case of Xi Jinping and what he thinks. I do not know personally what he thinks, but I suspect that if I were Xi Jinping, I would be more worried about a Trump presidency, given the some of the erratic behavior and inconsistencies that one might expect from a Trump administration, or at least a Trump presidency. So if I were him, I suspect I would be more worried about Trump. Then again, I think coming back to your initial question about whether or not there, the sort of similarities versus differences between a Trump or a Harris administration, I think Xi Jinping would be quite clear-eyed about the fact that there will be similarities across both administrations. And so let me outline some of my thoughts on that. In terms of similarities, in my view, I think that the differences between potential Trump or Harris administration are overstated. Both view China as the United States' primary or main strategic competitor. Second, I think both would prioritize the Indo-Pacific region, given its interests in countering China. And because of this interest in countering China, I think both would also seek to engage allies and partners to do so. Now, former President Trump has been accused of riding roughshod over and being dismissive of alliances. And of course, we might see him revert to his more transactional instincts and demanding greater contributions from allies. But I think a more hawkish and focused Trump 2.0 would ultimately seek to deepen security and economic ties with important allies and partners so as to better counter China. So I think Xi Jinping would likely have all these similarities in mind and not have too rosy a view about a potential Harris administration and what that might mean for China.
Ryan, let me bring you back in. I think one thing that has come up again and again in these conversations we've had all week is whether there is any daylight between Harris and Biden. We keep talking about the Biden-Harris administration, but we don't know exactly what Harris's own unique views are or her own policies are, not just on China, but Asia more broadly. Do you have any sense of where there might be daylight between the two of them?
Well, I will be irresponsibly speculative to offer a response to your question, which is that I think that Vice President Harris and Joe Biden, President Biden, are just products of different generations, different eras. President Biden grew up in a Cold War era where there was good versus evil, black versus white, democracy versus communism. And you see that carrying over to the way that he approaches competition with China today. He talks about the battle between democracy and autocracy, that we are at an inflection point in history, and that the good guys have to prevail. You don't hear Vice President Harris use that sweeping language. She's much more lawyerly and precise in the way that she talks about things. And she's a product of a different generation, a generation that grew up in the post-Cold War era, that doesn't necessarily see the world as divided between democracies versus autocracies, but sees a need for the United States to lead in confronting and galvanizing action to address global challenges. So that's where I think the principal distinction will be. And I think it'll be seen very acutely in the way that she approaches and deals with China and the rest of Asia.
And I want to just begin to broaden out a little bit outside of China itself, but to neighboring areas, which all, again, have to deal with China. And Lynn, I want to bring you back in here. The South China Sea, we've all been worried looking at the escalating tensions over the last few months between the Philippines and China. And the U.S. has a mutual defense treaty with Manila. Do you have any sense of how the two candidates might treat this particular issue differently?
Well, I think it's important to start with the similarities again. I think the broad goals and objectives between the two candidates are broadly the same. So both will be focused on securing what the United States refers to as freedom of navigation, but perhaps more accurately should be referred to as freedoms of the seas. Both would be focused on countering China's expansive claims, and both would be concerned about maintaining the rule of law in the South China Sea. I know Trump is always criticized for his lack of regard for international law, but I think it's also important to remember that it was Secretary Pompeo under a Trump administration that finally had the United States not just saying that both parties to the International Tribunal ruling needed to abide by the tribunal ruling, but going further to say that the United States was aligning its maritime claims and position on the ruling as well. Where we might see differences is in Trump versus Harris response to a potential triggering of the Mutual Defense Treaty that you pointed out. Whether or not Trump administration would in fact come to the Philippines' aid in the event of the triggering of that 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty. And also separately, whether or not the Trump administration or President Trump would demand greater contributions from the Philippines beyond the 9 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites, which the United States uses as facilities and could use in a potential war with China. And that would be damaging for the U.S. relations with the Philippines and potentially undermine its the sense of its reliability as an important ally. I think a Harris administration, given Vice President Harris's focus on international law, is likely to honor the Mutual Defense Treaty and not set it out as a negotiation or bargaining tool. I think she is going to stand very clearly behind the fact that it is an ironclad commitment vis-a-vis the Philippines, as the Biden-Harris administration has clearly stated. I suspect that at the outset of her administration, she is likely to reiterate both the fact that the Mutual Defense Treaty does cover the South China Sea, as well as the fact that it also covers Coast Guard vessels. So I think she's going to be quite clear about the extent of U.S. obligations under the Mutual Defense Treaty.
Ryan, I'm wondering if you agree there, but also take us to Taiwan, because that's another huge potential flashpoint that the United States might get involved with. And contrast the Trump and Harris approaches to defending Taiwan in the event of Chinese aggression.
Well, Ravi, if you look back at the record of President Trump's first administration and some of the recounting of it by Bob Woodward and others, President Trump continually goes back to this question: what are we getting out of our defense of our support for allies and partners? What are we gaining from it? He treats these relationships like an insurance company would treat a client that is underpaying on his or her premium. And the same, unfortunately, applies to Taiwan. He perennially asks why the United States is so committed to defending and protecting Taiwan. He refers to Taiwan as the tip of a Sharpie pen and to China as the resolute desk in the Oval Office. This is a pattern of thought that no one can unsee after they've seen it. And so we need to, take him seriously at his word that I think that he also believes that Taiwan has taken advantage of the United States by, in his words, stealing America's semiconductor industry and relocating it in Taiwan at America's disadvantage. And so if President Trump returns to office, I expect that he will focus on things like urging Taiwan to increase its defense spending, urging Taiwan to increase purchases of defense equipment from the United States, urging Taiwan to increase investments, including semiconductor investments, into the United States to support reshoring to the United States. And this will be sort of the animating focus of President Trump's approach to Taiwan. Whereas in the case of Vice President Harris, as Lynn was saying, I think that I've yet to encounter anyone who has been around her who says that she asks why we care about our allies and partners. I think it's just intrinsic, it's understood, and it's embedded in her worldview that the United States is stronger as the leader of a team than it would be standing alone. And I think that the Vice President Harris is also very committed to the idea that certain principles must be upheld, including the principle that territory should not be seized by force. And when you apply those to Taiwan, I think that she would be very stout in her defense of and her upholding of the commitments that the United States has made to Taiwan.
Ryan, as you were talking there, you could have been speaking about Europe in terms of the differences between the two candidates. A lot of what you said resonated with the Europe episode that we just had. But Lynn, as I continue to broaden this out a little bit more, there's a growing number of countries in Southeast Asia that think that they should align with China instead of the United States. And this is important in terms of how the next American president thinks about policy. But you've written a great essay about this, arguing that America's China policy is forcing it or making it lose Southeast Asia. Tell us why.
So first, let's take a step back. In the piece that you mentioned, I highlight an annual poll of Southeast Asia And in this poll, 2024 was the first year in which when respondents were asked who they would pick if they were, respondents from Southeast Asia were asked who they would pick if they were forced to align with the United States or China. The majority of respondents in that poll picked China over the United States. You mentioned that it's because of the US-China policy. I would argue that perhaps it is partly because of the US-China policy, but a result of weak US economic engagement with the region over the years, which has led to a gradual erosion of support for the United States if countries or respondents were forced to choose. And very importantly, in the last year, we saw a steep drop in support for the United States of about 20 percentage points among Muslim majority countries. And so
and these are countries like Indonesia, Malaysia,
and Brunei. And so I think that was what was ultimately responsible for tilting the poll towards China in this year's poll. And respondents were not asked the reason for them picking China over the United States. But if we look at a separate question in the poll, respondents were asked to rate or rank their top geopolitical concern, and about 50% selected the Israel-Hamas conflict as their top geopolitical concern. And the South China Sea dispute, which is more proximate for Southeast Asia, was only ranked the top dispute by 40% of respondents. So you can see how salient an issue Israel-Hamas is, even as far away as Southeast Asia. So I think, the US policy in Asia is affecting its position in the region, but also its policies out of Asia. So in this respect, in the Middle East is gravely or dangerously eroding its support in the region.
That's just fascinating. Ryan, let me bring you back in. One of the other trend lines, I think, in US foreign policy has been a big investment in industrial policy, which tends to favor bigger countries, right? So in a world in which every big country is trying to ensure that it protects its own supply chains, which is a post-pandemic phenomenon, these are things that smaller countries can't really compete on in the same way. And of course, Asia has a lot of those countries. You add to that, this is now specific to the Biden administration, but a focus on the G7, a group of rich countries. And of course, in Asia, Japan is in that group. South Korea wants to be in that group. What's your sense of how, again, Trump or Harris might differ on how they treat bigger groups like the G7, like the G20, and how that impacts Asia policy?
Well, my general impression, Ravi, is that President Trump prefers to deal with countries on a bilateral basis, where he can employ America's asymmetric power to try to, use leverage to secure concrete objectives. And Vice President Harris and President Biden have demonstrated greater comfort working in larger groupings. Now, that holds up to a point because the Biden-Harris administration has sort of tailored its approaches to countries that it prefers to deal with and lessened its emphasis on groupings that it finds less productive. So, for example, the G7 has a lot more energy under a Biden administration than the G20. The quadrilateral grouping involving the United States, Australia, Japan, and India has a lot more energy than ASEAN. And the reason is because these are purpose-built organizations that the United States feels like it can use to advance and accelerate progress on its priority areas. They're countries that are, by and large, democratic societies that sort of share similar values and similar visions. And so that's where a lot of the energy is. So if we sort of project forward into the next 4 years, I think the outcome of the U.S. election will sort of tell us whether we're going to be heading in a direction towards greater bilateral engagement to deal with specific issues, or groupings of like-minded countries that allow the United States to really play a disproportionate role in agenda setting going forward.
You know, Lynn, as you were talking about the way in which Southeast Asian countries, especially Muslim majority ones, weight U.S. policy in the Middle East as they think about aligning more closely with the United States or with China, I'm curious where South Asia fits into this. Again, the countries there have even greater Muslim majorities. India has the second most number of Muslims in the world after Indonesia. And then you have Pakistan and Bangladesh, both of which have upwards of 150 million Muslims each. What is your sense of how that part of the world is viewing American policy in Asia? And to Ryan's point, it could be that there are overriding principles, such as maybe the Quad, such as other interests that take precedence for them over the Middle East, for example. Your thoughts?
Well, I don't work closely on South Asia. However, at least when we talk about India, the approach that we've seen from India thus far has perhaps out-trumped Trump in some respects in terms of its degree of how transactional it is. You talk about the quadrilateral security dialogue, the quadrilateral grouping. But also before that, we had the US Indo-Pacific strategy, which focused on the maritime domain and brought India in as a key player. So India in the last, since about 2017 has really been rising in prominence in terms of its diplomatic engagement and its proximity or closeness to some of the key Western powers. And I think it's worked to take advantage of that rise in diplomatic strength to serve its own national interests, which is understandable given that all countries seek to serve their own national interests first and foremost. Trump isn't the only one talking about America first. But in the case of India, I think it has actually its view of its national interests might depart in important respects from some of the other Quad members, for example. So, for instance, it's a terrible crime when China supposedly breaches its sovereignty in its disputed border, and the rule of law needs to be upheld there. But it's less offensive in the Indian mind somehow when Russia invades Ukraine. So, I think in respect of what's happening in the Middle East, I suspect that India might, as a government, actually, its foreign policy is unlikely to be too much disturbed by what's happening in the Middle East, despite its large Muslim population, and it will stay the course in terms of what it perceives to be in its best, quite calculated national interests.
And of course, it's worth pointing out Muslims are still only 14% of India's population. So even though it's large in raw numbers, it's a minority, definitely. Ryan, let me bring you back in. Something Lynn said there stayed with me. She used the phrase out-trumped Trump. And it occurs to me that during the Trump era, there were all these reports of countries and leaders that realized that Trump was transactional and that the best way to handle Trump when he was president was to make him feel like he was winning in any bilateral negotiation or discussion, So this is reports from the Koreans, reports from the Indians and elsewhere. And it strikes me that we might be in a sort of post-Trump world, or a Trump world, I should point out, where, Asians just want to be more transactional, that whether or not Trump comes back to power, they're realizing that they're best off just being more transactional with the US. Do you agree?
Up to a point, Ravi. I think that a lot of countries in Asia, their self-identity is that they are not subordinate to China, that China does not dominate the region. And so I think that, yes, there will be more transactionalism if President Trump is reelected, but that's not going to wash away the overriding strategic imperatives that countries across Asia have for having a balancing power that is willing to exercise its influence to uphold certain principles. And so if the United States is unwilling or unable to perform that function, I expect that these countries will look elsewhere, including by bandwagoning amongst themselves to try to guard against being overrun by China's ascendance.
But what do you say, Ryan, to the view across many Asian countries that they're not always happy with U.S. policy on China? They feel that America's been far too hawkish over the last 7 or 8 years, and that hawkishness is going to harm them eventually. They worry about the rising tensions. They blame America for some of those tensions. And of course, for many of them, many Asian countries, China is their biggest trading partner. So they're not thrilled with U.S. foreign policy.
What I say, Robbie, is that we should listen. We should listen to what our partners and our allies tell us about what their interests are. America's unique advantages in this long-term competition with China are its domestic dynamism, its alliances and partnerships around the world, and its ability to galvanize solutions to global and regional problems. We do best in all those areas when we are closely linked up with our allies and partners, and we're listening and taking on board their interests and their concerns. The reality is that we have a very unique view of China. No other country in the world shares the threat perception that we do of China, because no other country is the leader that feels threatened by China's rise in the way that we do. And so it's absolutely essential for us to listen, to be empathetic, and to find ways to align our policies with the top interests and concerns of those who we consider to be our closest friends in the region.
Len, it's hard to disagree with Ryan's prescription of listening and being empathetic, but if you had one piece of advice for the next president of the United States on Asia policy, pick a country, pick an area, what would it be?
Well, if I may, 3 points. First, I would say that I would urge the next president of the United States in its security, on the security front, to be consistent in its strategic approach. And this means, ensuring that its actions are strongly undergirded by international law and consistently applied throughout. And in the defense of international law, I would urge the next administration, as you pointed out earlier, not to be unduly confrontational, because if we listen to some of the Southeast Asian countries, at least, I think Northeast Asia is slightly different, but if we listen to some of the Southeast Asian countries and how they highlight the main concerns that they face, they highlight the challenges posed by increasing U.S.-China competition and the possibility of the outbreak of a war more highly, I think, and they actually rarely mention their concerns about China's activities in the South China Sea. So they're worried about an unduly confrontational U.S. approach. Second, of course, and we've heard this often, and I needn't have to say it again, but I think we need better implementation in this respect, greater economic engagement with Asia. And the third area in which I think that I would urge the United States to work on is, of course, greater both bilateral as well as multilateral engagement with the region. I think it's done well in Northeast Asia in terms of aligning itself with Northeast Asia, Japan and South Korea in terms of the threats facing the region. But I think there is still a great divergence in terms of threat perceptions in Southeast Asia, and focusing on a few countries like the Philippines as well as Vietnam might backfire on the United States, because as we see, its reputation in other countries is deteriorating. And even in the case of, say, the Philippines, a very strong US ally right now, the Philippines is still part of ASEAN. And given the sometimes inconsistent approach towards Asia policy seen in the United States over the last few years, the Philippines might also be afraid in the future to go too far ahead of the ASEAN pack. So I think it makes sense for the next president as well, not just to engage with important countries bilaterally, but also engage multilaterally with ASEAN, so that you have the entire region as a whole more on board with what the United States is seeking to do, which is, of course, to defend and promote the rule of international law.
欢迎来到六度解析，新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的六度解析中， 我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，6度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事，通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是6度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的6度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程，从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在6度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼